Well, good evening, church. So, about a week ago, Ross said, "Hey, I think you should teach numbers." And I said, "Oh, you shouldn't have." But here we are, and I really am excited to be teaching the Word of God tonight. It's passages like Numbers that are interesting, and hopefully it can draw us a better appreciation of who our God is. And so if you have your outline, I'll be loosely following the outline. During our time together, I'm going to be going over the summary, kind of more of the narrative of what's happening in Numbers. I'm going to stop and maybe kind of go over a little more of what's applicable today for us as well. And so as you see, the author is Moses of the book of Numbers. It's our fourth book of the Pentateuch out of the first 5 books of the Bible. Numbers summarizes Israel's journey from Mount Sinai to the borders of the Promised Land. And so this summary is probably around 40 years of the nation of Israel's history, and that likely falls around 1440 BC to 1406. And so tonight you'll see the purpose of this book, the book of Numbers, is to show kind of a gradual fulfillment to Abraham that his children will be the people of God that would eventually occupy the land of Canaan. And so we see God's presence is actually within this book. We'll see it through the pillar of the cloud and the fire over the tabernacle. That's how we know the presence of the Lord is with Israel. And it also shows that Israel's unbelief is going to delay their entry into the Promised Land as well, and that costs them many lives. But ultimately, through it all, God has prepared his people to enter the land by the end of this book. And so the book of Numbers can actually be broken down into 3 times that they're in the wilderness, and in between those 3 times, there's some travel passages. And so there in your outline, I have them going from the wilderness of Sinai to traveling to the wilderness of Paran to traveling to the wilderness of Moab to finish the book. And so what's interesting about the Israelites' trip from the Mount Sinai to the land of Canaan was by foot, that would only take 2 weeks. And yet God let them wander for 40 years because of their unbelief. Ross also reminded me it's because they didn't have maps. And that is another reason. They probably went in circles. Our book we are studying tonight, it gets a bad rap because of the name. Does anyone know the Hebrew name of the book? It is Bamidbar, and that means in the wilderness. And so along the way, our English translation changed it to Numbers because there's census taking at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. But I think wilderness is a lot cooler of a name. And so just to give you all a little context of what's happening and what Ross has been teaching us is they have come to Mount Sinai. They've been here for about a full year. Moses is on top of Mount Sinai. God gives him a covenant. God gives him the 10 Commandments. Israel immediately breaks the covenant when Moses goes back down from the mountain. But God is still gracious with his people, and so he has built a tabernacle so he can be in the presence of the Israelites. And so now we're going to get into chapters 1 through 10, and you'll see in your outline there's a good number of things that happen in 1 through 10. For the sake of our time, though, we're not going to get in the weeds of these things, although they are very important things. But this is all about Israel preparing to enter the Promised Land. And so they take a census as they prepare to leave. And this is also where their laws are and how all their tribes need to be organized and arranged in their camp. And also when God moves, they were called to move as well. And so God gives them instructions on how to organize their camp. And so the first thing and the most important thing is the presence of the tabernacle had to be in the center of their camp. And then after that, the tribes of Levi and the priests were around this tabernacle, and then the remaining tribes surrounded the tabernacle as well. And it almost looked like the formation looked like a shape of the cross. I don't know if there's any symbolism there or not, but there is actual visual symbolism of all this, is God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people to a lost world. And so when they were instructed, when the cloud of God's presence leaves, so would they. And so in chapters 5 through 10, you're going to see there really harps on the laws of ritual purities. If God was going to be in Israel's midst, they needed a place to welcome God's holiness. And so 1 through 10 is important. It shows us the holiness of God. It shows us the love of God to give us the requirements for us to be in His presence. But part 2 is where things get really interesting. It's one of our traveling sections. This is a short part of the story where things just start popping off. Moving to the second part of chapter 10, the presence of the Lord moves. And so this is what they've been preparing for from chapters 1 through 10. Okay, God is moving us to the promised land. Here we go. God is on our side. We're ready. What could go wrong? Yeah, the laughs. You guys know. This book of the Bible is so interesting. It's almost cinematic. It's like a bad horror movie where everything starts great. We're on a road trip. Nothing can go wrong. And then everything does go wrong. And then someone is a hero at the end of the day. And so bear with me. What you see, picture it like a movie scene. And that's exactly what's happening. When we get on the road in chapter 11, just a few days in, the people of Israel are already complaining. They're, oh, Moses, we don't have our food. We're so hungry. I get that we have manna coming out of the sky, but I'm so sick of that manna. Man, I could really use some protein right now. I had all the fish I could eat in Israel. And so their thoughts were leading them eventually to going back to Egypt. And so something for us to take away from chapter 11 and really this whole book is that there is a connection with our sin and dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction shows us way more about the conditions of our hearts rather than what our circumstances actually are. Yeah, the Israelites, they were in the wilderness. That could not have been fun. But think about where they were in Egypt. Think about all the things that God had led them out of. They were no longer enslaved. They lived free lives. God was pressing them into the land that they belonged into. But the same thing goes for us. Can't we complain about a lot of things too in this life? We even complain about circumstances that haven't even happened to us yet. I do it all the time. And so when discontentment comes, we can even complain about our circumstances, or we can really look internally to what's happening. When discontentment comes, we need to look first, not at our conditions, but we actually need to look at our hearts. Why am I not happy in my marriage? It's probably not because of what my spouse is doing. Why am I disgruntled with my job? It's probably not my work conditions. Why am I dissatisfied with my church? It's probably not the people. For too many times, the problem rests internally and not externally. Just like Israel, we too can long for comforts that we once had in enslavement. Because I'm in the flesh and I want to revert back to my comforts than what I desired when I wasn't a believer. There are reasons in our lives where we cry out for the comforts of old, not realizing that God has something better in line planned for us ahead. And so it's inevitable. When you walk through some deserts in your life, God will lead you into those deserts. But in those trying seasons in your life, know the Lord is using that. He is weaning you off the things of the world so that you can have Him. God's goodness is defined by His nature, not our circumstances. So trust in that. Wherever God has you, whatever you're dealing with tonight, trust that God has you right where He wants you. He's making you more into the image of His Son day by day. Well, Israel, they didn't understand that. The negativity and the doubts of Israel has left Moses drained. Their leader was shot, and he actually cries to God. In Numbers 11, he says, God, why have you given me a people like this to lead? I cannot do this by myself, and alone, I honestly would rather die. But God was gracious with Moses. Instead of killing Moses, He appointed Moses some elders. He said, grab some of the elders from each tribe and let them come to the tent of meeting. And once that happened, God placed a spirit on these elders. And in Numbers 11:17, he says, they shall bear the burden of the people with you so that you may not bear it alone. I think a problem that we can create with a lot of churches today is we just allow everything to fall on the pastor. Hey, Pastor Ross, do your job. Just make it happen. But thankfully, we're in a church where you guys have hired associate pastors who can bounce things off. And I just pray for you guys as a church to just emerge as leaders who can help shepherd our flock well. And so continue to pray for that. Continue to pray that leaders will rise up in our church who we can hear wisdom, who have walked through seasons of life well. And so God continues to be faithful with the people of Israel. He sends them quail for their wants of protein, but he also sends a plague for their greediness. And that leads us to chapter 12. Aaron and Miriam, Moses' own brother and sister, they reject his leadership. Openly, they criticize whether Moses was their leader. And God puts a stop to that really quick. He says, Moses is the most meek man on the planet, and I have chosen him to be my leader. And so, interestingly enough, when the presence of the Lord left, Miriam actually had leprosy from her doubting of Moses being the man of God. And so to oppose Moses, who God had put in this position, was also to oppose God himself. Ultimately, he was saying, your doubts are not in Moses, your doubts are in me. So Miriam, she quickly repents, and 7 days later, she was healed from her leprosy. And this moves us to part 3 of our story, the wilderness of Paran. We'll see this in chapters 13 through 19. So God tells Moses to send out 12 spies to check out the land. This is one of the most memorable times in the book of Numbers. And so they scout out the land, and it had much fruit. It was a land flowing of milk and honey, but it was not going to be something they can just easily walk into. No, this land, it actually had a good number of large-sized men. It had fortified walls, and the fact Israel was terrible, and they did not want to get in battle with anyone at this point. The men occupying this land were strong men, but Caleb and Joshua come back, the only 2 optimistic spies, and told the people, hey, we can take this land, and we should attack now. Unfortunately, the people did not listen to Caleb and Joshua. In fact, they are further removing themselves from the plan of God. They begin to panic, thinking of if we fought for this land, we could all easily die. And so they question why God would even bring them all the way out here just to die in the wilderness when they could have lived long lives in Egypt. They were thinking, this is not safe of God. What is he doing? And he'll be the reason our children will die. Our children will die in the hands of the Canaanites. It's sad, the majority of the spies, they were viewing solely from a human perspective. Their review of the land, it was probably legitimate. It had great points, but there was no acknowledgement that God was with them. And so people doubted, not because of the ability of God, they doubted in their own inability. All the while, God had promised them this land. Think about that. They rejected the idea because of their own efforts. Why doubt your inability when God is the promise keeper who never breaks those promises? When God promises something, we trust, and we are fully expectant that he will deliver. And looking today as the church, these words hold true for us. We must not limit what God can do through his people. If we are to have faith, let us have faith that he will allow us to fall forward if we're going to fall, trusting that he is going to carry us along the way. I pray that God would mold more of us into like Caleb and Joshua, who in chapter 14, verse 8, they cried, if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land and give it to us. What stark contrast does Caleb and Joshua have compared to the cowardice of the other 10 spies? You see, their faith was knowing they were not in control, but God was fully in control. Unfortunately, the spies' pessimism that spreads through the people of Israel, and they make up their mind in fear and emotion that they need to grab a new leader and they need to get back to Egypt. Luckily, God stops that, and we'll talk about that at the end of this talk. But basically, the people of Israel refused to go to the land that God had promised them. The faithful saw milk and honey, but the unfaithful saw obstacles and death. And so, hear me, church, sin or obedience, God will honor that choice. And other than a remnant that included Joshua and Caleb, God tells Moses that this generation will wander and they will die in the wilderness for 40 years. And so they have denied themselves of the promised land, and the children they were so worried about that God was going to kill will actually be the ones to see the land because they will be faithful to me. And so this is a constant reminder in the book of Numbers. This is a constant reminder for all of us, not just Israel. But God is always faithful to his people and his promises. And yet he will honor our choices and let us waste our lives if we choose to live it in rebellion. And that's a scary consequence. And that leads us to our fourth part in our road trip, the travel from Paran to Moab. How would you rate the trip so far? Do you think it's going well? A little shaky, I would say. It's like a family vacation where like you're loaded up in the car and like you know you're headed to something good, but you know it's going to be bad. And that's where Israel is, I feel like. But by this point, most of the older generation, they have died out and the young ones have gotten a little older. Unfortunately, part 4 gets a little worse before it gets better. In chapter 20, we see our great leader, Moses, he disqualifies himself from entering the promised land. So Israel is begging a thirst. They grab Moses and say, hey, if we are to go, we need water or we're going to die before we make it there. And so God gives Moses specific instructions on giving them water through the rock. He says, speak to the rock and water will come bursting out. Because God commands him to speak to the rock for the water to come out, but out of his anger, Moses starts striking the rock twice, and then the water rushes out for the Israelites. But because of that, that shows Moses' lack of faith in God. And it also shows us even God's leaders are still accountable for their consequences of sin. And so because of that, Moses will never see the promised land. One of the craziest stories actually follows in chapter 21. Once again, Israel sins, and God allows his people to be attacked by serpents for their doubting of the Lord. So think about that. Like serpents just come up to camp. They're getting bit. They're not dumb, so they start repenting pretty quick from this. They go to Moses and say, hey, we messed up. We did not trust the Lord. Please help us. And so a good holy snake attack will do that to you, I've been told. So the Lord commands Moses, he says, make a bronze serpent to place high on a pole, and those who are bitten, they can look at this, and when they fix their eyes upon this, they will be healed. There is so much underneath that is foreshadowing of what's to come. And what's interesting about what God was doing with this is Israel was actually passing through an area with large copper mines. And so most likely this snake would have been a reddish-looking monument. And so God was sparing the people of Israel's life, but also showing the ultimate atonement would come from the red blood of Christ, in which Jesus in John 3:14 would compare his own death to the uplifted serpent. And so even in God's judgment, we can see it can be transformed into a source of life for those who are seeking God's healing. But with most things, the Israelites, they can't hardly see anything ahead. But here's an observation we can take through all these rebellions that we've seen in this book. God is still providing faithfully for these people. He pours food out of the sky for them. Water come out of rocks, but the complaints keep coming. And they continually wish to be back in Egypt as they were slaves at once. And so here we have a people who don't deserve any more grace. If I was God, or for Moses for that matter, I would have been done with this group a long time ago. But God remains faithful, which makes the last part of our road trip even more interesting. We have reached the wilderness of Moab, and this is chapters 22 through 36. Israel is passing through Moab, And the king of Moab, his name was Balak, is absolutely terrified of this large group of people passing through. He reasons that this group of Israelites, they're either going to attack us or they're so large in number, they're going to suck up all our resources. And so we need something to stop them. And so what Israel doesn't know is they're walking through the plains of Moab. And there's this whole civilization on these hills watching them. And so the king of Moab, he hires a pagan sorcerer named Balaam to speak curses over them. But the thing about it is Balaam can only speak blessings upon Israel. And so if you read closely, Balaam is actually not a great guy or a saint at first. Now, he might have became a believer in the true God. And actually, his intentions during most of the time is out of wealth and greed. But I want you to see, this is one of the most wittiest and amusing tales in the Bible in which God is making a serious point. He's saying the one true God is for Israel, and no human power can prevail against that. And Balaam catches on to that pretty quick. It may seem kind of odd that God used such a corrupt character to deliver his words over the blessings of Israel, but this is the same God that can use a donkey to speak. And that is actually what we get in chapter 22. Balaam is on his way to visit Moab, and the king of Moab, and they've already begged him twice to come. They've given him a ton of money, so he said, I think I'll go. And on his way there, along the journey, God placed an angel on the road with a sword. And so what's interesting is Balaam does not see this angel, but his donkey does. And his donkey cuts across the road really quick. And so think about the comedy of that. Here's Balaam, this world-renowned expert in magic who cannot see this death angel in front of him, but his donkey can. God has a way of humbling the proud. And so over the next few chapters, Balaam, he gets cornered by the donkey. He keeps beating the donkey, and then God lets the donkey speak. And what the donkey actually says to him is kind of similar to how a parent would talk down to a child, saying, what are you doing to me? Have I ever led you astray? And then actually the angel said, if your donkey had not moved, I would have killed you. But she has spared you, and since she has spared you, I will spare you. And here's the thing, though. You cannot speak any curses against Israel, and you can only give them what God says. And so over the next few chapters, Balaam, who was meant to curse, can only speak blessing over Israel. And he gives them 3, in which the last was a promise of a king that would somehow be connected to that God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations. Think of what God is doing, how he's shaking up and moving all these things. Now let's flash back to these Israelites, right where we left them, in their complaints and their whining and their groanings to go back to Egypt. Here in Israel, the present complaining in the valley, having no idea that God was protecting them in the hills. Not only protecting them in the hills, but he was blessing them as well. This is a God full of grace for his people, protecting them from things they had no idea they needed protection from. And so are you with your life. There are so many things in our lives that God is actively protecting us and working out for your good that you are not even aware of in the moment. And so the book here, it closes with them and Moab. They will take a census once again as the new generation is ready to enter the promised land. Joshua is appointed the new successor to Moses, and Moses gives them a final speech of wisdom and warning, and that'll be actually our next book of the Bible, Deuteronomy. It's a collection of his speeches on these things. So Israel wandering, ironically, it was both literally and metaphorically, God shows up again and again, telling his own story of love, his own story of justice, his mercy. And if you look hard enough, we get these small glimpses of these future one-and-done acts of a chain-breaking deliverance that would happen through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. So moving on to these gospel undertones, this redemptive history, here's some things I want you to see about the book of Numbers. The first is this: God affirms his leadership. And we need an intercessor to be amongst a holy God. I think we can see this in Numbers 16 and 17. This is after God had let them wander for 40 years. He has decided that they will not seek the promised land this generation. There is a group of prominent leaders within Israel. One was Korah, and there were several others who raised up and they questioned Aaron and Moses' leadership. The main problem was Korah had no significant difference in ethical holiness and God's own appointing of priesthood. So essentially he was saying, Moses and Aaron, you guys are just like us. We're people of God. We practice the law as well. There's really no difference. Therefore, we're going to take over from here. And so Moses warns them, and he also petitions them that I have done nothing to abuse my power of office. And yet God will not stand for this. He says to Aaron and Moses, you need to get away from these men right now. And because of their rebellion, God opens the ground and he consumes Korah and around 250 men who opposed Aaron and Moses. That's heavy. That shows us we do not go against God's leadership. And so can you imagine just Aaron and Moses thinking like, God, you've entrusted us with these people, and the ground just opened up on them. And it got worse, actually. The next day, the people of Israel, they said, man, y'all are the reason Korah died. And Aaron and Moses are thinking like, what else could we have done? We are simply following the Lord. And so God, once again, angered by his people, he was willing to wipe them out and just restart with Aaron and Moses. But Aaron intercedes on the behalf of them. Aaron intercedes to God and spares Israel. A man that they were trying to overturn, out of his love for the people, he intercedes for them. God eventually lets go of his wrath and he listens to Aaron. And God then proceeds a visual representation of who his leaders are. So he says, I want you to go into the camp, all 12 tribes of Israel's leaders, and I want you to put your staff in the tent of meeting and come back, and I will show who my leaders are. And so they leave, and in Numbers 17:8, they appear to the tent. And it says, the next day Moses entered the tent, and he saw Aaron's staff, which was represented the tribe of Levi, had not only sprouted, but it had budded and blossomed and produced almonds. That is a beautiful passage. That is affirming God's leadership for Aaron and Moses. And not only is it affirming, but the fruit in it shows that it was a good thing. In terms of a mediator, nothing has changed from that day to this day. You and I still need a mediator between us and God. And so how can we live our lives pleasing to God? How can we blossom and flourish and experience the favor of God as a church? Do we try harder? Do we read more of our Bible? Do we attend more church things? Do we curse less? Do we do more charitable works? Those things are good, but they don't put us in favor with God. We could never do enough to be worthy to be our own mediators with him. Just like Korah, we need someone to mediate for us or we will perish. Just as Israel needed a priest and a mediator to be with God, so do we, and we have that in the high priest, which is Christ Jesus. So let me tell you, church, your favor is not found in being the best parent. It's not found in our morals. It's not found in being a prominent voice in this church. It's not found in the title of my job or my accolades. It's not even found in the talents that God has given us. So how can we be pleasing to God? How can we flourish and blossom? We experience by tying ourselves to Christ. But by hiding in Jesus' atoning work, he is the way to life. He is the fruit in our lives. The Father is pleased with the Son, and those who hide in the Son will follow the Son and find favor with God. His offering alone is acceptable to the Father. And that leads us to our second point. Jesus is the greater Moses. Moses was good, but we need something better. I find it interesting that the Bible has no problem in marring its main figures. In chapter 20, it shows Moses sins. As much good Moses has done, he's still prone to make sinful decisions. And what God is trying to do with these passages is to communicate that the hero of the story is not Moses. The hero of the story is a good and faithful God, and it points me to something so much better and so much greater, which is Christ. Yes, Moses got to do some amazing things. He carried the law down from the mountain. But your high priest would carry it back up in the form of a cross, where he would die a terrible death, finalizing and ending the curse of sin that burdened people, the humanity's original sin from the garden. That leads us to our third thought. Not only is this just for one people, not only is that just for Israel, but this is also for you. Jesus has burdened or carried the burden not of just Israel, but he has carried the burden of the world. The blessings of Abraham to all peoples would one day reach you and I in here tonight. Balaam's blessing would one day reach you. What started as one people group would eventually lead to all peoples. What started as a promised land would once enter into an eternal kingdom. Moses was overwhelmed with the burden of one people group, but Jesus takes the burden of all people groups on his shoulders and alone carries it to the cross. The wrath that Moses pled for God to turn away time and time again was absorbed by your mediator, which is Jesus. He bore the full brunt of our sinful lives. Whereas Moses and the law he represented was not able to lead the Israelites to the promised land, Jesus leads us triumphantly into our promised land, which is our eternity with him. This concludes our summary of Numbers. And every time I think about our mediator and our high priest, and when I was thinking about just the promised land in general, I thought about men like who we lost today, Mr. Jim O'Neill. And I never really got a chance to get to know him one-on-one, but I've seen the ripple effects he has made in this church and the relationships and how much he cared for each and every one of you. It was an amazing time to gather around him Sunday night. And I'll never forget, he was mustering up words, and some of the last things he kept saying was, "He is faithful. He is faithful. He is faithful. Thank you, thank you." I'll never forget that. This man understood the gospel. He hurts no longer. He's in a way better condition than us because his leader has led him to the promised land. He has a great and high priest who has interceded on his behalf, and that is for all of us in here tonight. We can all have that hope. We don't have to wonder because Christ abolished death. Therefore, we will enter the promised land one day if we are just faithful to trust in the promise.